Joining us today for our webinar, Compliance for Your Trusted Access. SSH Communication Security is happy to host this webinar to help organizations prepare for their annual audit and compliance cycles as they need to apply necessary controls for their most critical and trusted access. During this webinar, you will obtain a general overview of compliance challenges facing organizations around the world, regardless of industry or vertical. You will gain insight in an often overlooked and hidden access gap which requires compliance policies and controls. And lastly, you will learn what best practices you should consider to ensure governance is truly in place for the most privileged and trusted access found within your current environment. It is my pleasure to introduce our resident audit expert and compliance practitioner, Fouad Khalil. Fouad has extensive experience in the technology space with more than 25 years spanning disciplines in software development, IT support, program and project management, and most recently IT security and compliance management. Key areas of focus for him include information technology, internal controls, over financial reporting, Sarbanes-Oxley, PCI DSS, and HIPAA high-tech compliance. You can hear more from Fouad as he's often speaking at various compliance events such as ISACA and ISC Squared. With that, it is my pleasure to turn over the controls to Fouad. Fouad, please take it away.
Thank you, Ruben, and happy afternoon, happy Thursday, everybody. Thank you again for joining the call. I like to conduct these presentations in a way where it's very practical, down to earth, and a plain English approach. So I hope to go through this in a way that keeps it interesting to you and allows you to get some thoughts going and ask me some questions. And just for the record, whatever you don't get to ask, if we run out of time, you will have access to my information, and I'll be more than happy to respond to any email inquiries after the presentation wraps up. So today, we're going to be talking about, excuse me. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about history, what's hot in 2017. I'd like to discuss the concept of this, it's all about the data. Talk about what the gap I'd like to shed some light on today. Bring into light, if you haven't heard, about the NIST IR 7966. And of course, it's best to walk away from discussions as such with best practice implementations and what you can do with information I'll provide back at your organizations and next steps that are possible for you to take. And of course, at the end, we'll go into Q&A. So let's take a little bit of history look here. If you look at it from a compliance perspective, I mean, going back as far as '96, we've had the HIPAA law. HHS provided the law at the time enacted by President Bill Clinton in '96, and basically it was directed at protecting personal health information. Of course, after the major credit card companies experienced breaches themselves, we had the PCI DSS come into play, and the most recent version is version 3.2. From my perspective, PCI DSS is the most extensive, straight, to the point security standard out there. And they cover every gamut of the security spectrum that we need to be concerned with. So it's a great framework to reference. And of course, after the Enron, WellCom, and those lovely cases that we all heard about, Sarbanes-Oxley came into play into 2002. And that affects all publicly traded financial organizations. Now, of course, HIPAA got on steroids, and we have high-tech. And the High-Tech Act was simply making those protected health information breach notification worthy, i.e. if there's a potential compromise of your PHI, you'll have to notify. And the notification requirements under HIPAA and high-tech are a lot more stringent than other notification requirements for PII, PCI, and the like. Of course, ISO, which has a global presence, it's an excellent framework that also recently came out, and it addresses security management systems and talks about best practices and so on, and it's a great reference as well. And last but not least, NIST and the cybersecurity framework. And that continues to evolve and continues to be a key framework that is being adopted across the board, across all industries. So what have we seen? I mean, during this presentation, I'm going to bring some stuff up that you all have seen, but I like to tell the story in a perspective that leads to the point I'm trying to make with this whole presentation. So you can go as far back as MySpace, a popular website at one point, and a hacker came in and stole 427 million records, which equate to 390 million records. Actually, 427 million passwords, which equate to 390 million records. And the data is being sold still today. TJMX and Marshalls, another famous one, it was the first largest credit and debit card data theft. Anthem, a criminal hacker broke into their servers and stole millions of PII and PHI. U.S. voter database. We've had a lot of voter database issues, but this one's particularly with 191 million records. An independent computer security, they uncovered that the database of that information was exposed to the internet due to an incorrectly configured database. So that was a human error or a system-generated error, whatever it may be, but that's the reason for that breach. JP Morgan Chase, one of the largest banks in the U.S., they basically leveraged an exploit in their applications being presented online, and they were able to connect via those vulnerabilities into their programs, and the data was started to be stolen from there. It goes beyond just financial data and beyond credit card information. There's lots of personal information as well that was breached. Look at Heartland, 130 million records. That is a data breach at a payment processing firm. That's, again, credit card and debit card information. And that's from all major credit card brands. Heartland, to my knowledge, they ended up settling for more than 110 million with major credit card companies like the Visa, MasterCard, and the American Express. Target was a huge breach. After the breach, there were some reports indicating that Target had no controls limiting access to their systems and point-of-sale devices. In one instance, during their testing and the reports they posted, researchers were able to communicate with cash registers from a deli meat scale in a different store. So you can imagine how wide open that network was at that time. I'll love to bring this one up. This is a friend finder network. That's the largest breach as well in that type of industry. And the company, which is the parent company is for adult type websites. It was hacked through a local file inclusion exploit. It basically opened the door to all their network sites. And last but not least, Yahoo, which is the biggest of all, with 500 million records up to this point. And Yahoo confirmed that the copy of a certain user account information was stolen from the company's network in late 2014 by what they believe is a state-sponsored actor. Just to look back to 2016, we reported 1,093 breaches. That's 40% hike from 2015. And what is the number today, as of this morning, for the number of breaches total since 2013? We are at 5.91 billion records. Okay, so now we have regulations brewing. We have breaches happening. And unfortunately, there is no end in sight. Regulators are not going to let up anytime soon. You look at the latest regulatory news. Europe and any organization working with any European citizen information have to deal with the Global Data Protection Regulation, which is going to take effect May of 2018. If you're familiar with the security breach legislation in the U.S., which is enacted by, I think, about 48 out of the 50 states in the U.S., basically, if a PII is compromised or potentially compromised, you have to report. GDPR takes that on steroids as well. It looks at all that data and beyond. It also looks at your online information, your cookie information, your IP address, and all of that is reportable information. At the same time, they're pushing down the regulations of the organizations by enacting roles, data privacy officials and the like, to make sure that there are assigned individuals responsible for that data that's being handled. So that is another tidal wave that's going to hit the European Union. Started now, of course, but the compliance deadline is May of 2018. A lot of people wonder what the new Trump administration will bring to the table, what changes will happen. Well, guess what? U.S. states are starting to act on their own, and they're establishing cybersecurity regulations for financial firms, for example. New York State is the first one to take that action. If you're familiar with the HIPAA and the audits that have been executed by Office for Civil Rights and Health and Human Services, they started doing on-site audits, then they moved and to cut budget down, and they started doing them remote. They're learning that remote doesn't cut it. So if you're in the health industry and there's a potential for an auditor knocking on your door, it's not going to be remote. You're going to have an actual person with requirements knocking on your door, will start asking for documentation and evidence. And you also heard about penalties. There's a Office for Civil Rights wall of shame, which grows daily. Basically, any health organization that has 250 or I think 500 more records breached, they will end up on the wall of shame. And all the details about that breach and the company name and the like will be on there. And if a breach is confirmed or a non-compliance violation is confirmed, they're settling out there in the millions with these different firms. So penalties and fines are happening. And I'd like to bring up also the fact that single factor, two-factor is not good enough anymore. Multi-factor, which is being emphasized a lot under PCI and is being pushed by financial organizations and will continue to coming down the pike for all of us to consider. All right, now that we look back at these rags and looked at the stories and looked at some of the things that are brewing now, what do we see coming down the pike in 2017? This information I'm sharing with you is based on research and what I hear in the various conferences and networks I join. One of the things that's always on the table is governance, risk, and compliance. It is a hot topic on all C-level from an IT perspective. GRC is simply a corporate objective for improving governance, okay? So you can have effective compliance to better understand the risk of your business. This has to be in place with especially financial institutions to make sure that they can have effective controls, and as they make their annual and quarterly attestations and they go through their audits, they have an evidence of a mature process, mature technology, and mature or trained individuals. And we've all heard for years financial institutions saying we will never migrate to the cloud. Well, guess what? Everyone is. The question is here at this point, how do we migrate our compliance as well? That becomes another challenge. Reliance on third party, unavoidable. It's excellent in reducing cost, but unfortunately comes with a very high risk. In some cases, it may be your greatest cybersecurity risk. And the wall of shame I mentioned earlier with the health organizations, a lot of the contributing factors for those breaches are due to unmonitored, unmanaged, uncontrolled third-party access to protected health information. IoT, the buzzword, you see it at every heading, in every article, at every conference. But what are we really saying? I mean, we all realize it's the buzzword. We all realize that it's being utilized. We all realize they're expanding. Unfortunately, many of those devices are insecure by design. And as they exponentially expand, the risk is going to go at a proportional rate. So we have to keep an eye on those devices and manage them. Include them in your governance processes. Include them in your security management processes. They must be controlled as everything else. Of course, I wouldn't have any presentation but not talking about the regulators and not letting up anytime soon. And everything is brewing. Keep an eye on that. And of course, it wouldn't be the look ahead without considering cybersecurity. Cyber attacks are becoming business as usual for every organization in every industry. So you can see, in addition to our normal day-to-day duties and trying to get their job done and leave home in time to join the family for dinner, well, guess what? There's continuously challenges coming down the road that is going to face each and every one of us that we need to be prepared. In my opinion, having a continuous compliance and a true governance, risk, and compliance framework and leveraging a flexible framework for which you can comply and deploy technology to using will put you in a very good place. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of this stuff in later slides. Okay, just to emphasize some of the things I talked to as far as the future coming, you start looking ahead, and we talk about cybersecurity. I mean, a new report from IIA, cybersecurity remains a top business priority. Cyber incidents and data breaches carry the threat of significant operational and reputational damage for all organizations. There's no doubt. If you look at IoT, much already has been written about IoT, like I mentioned earlier. They pose risk to the internet. Now, you can look at the IoT as well from an internal perspective. They are critical to our network. They are critical to our infrastructure. They are critical for our intranet and internal use. So not only need to be concerned with IoT externally, you must be concerned with IoT internally, even within your perimeter or firewall. This was a shocking data that I saw as far as most attackers need less than 12 hours to break in. The methods that are used by pen testers to break into a network are typically about less than 12 hours. 4 in 10 can do it in barely 6 hours. This is just the release findings from a survey of 70 penetration testers conducted at DEF CON last year. So this is scary. In barely 6 hours, somebody can penetrate your network and all your fancy firewall gadgets and DLP and SIMs, and they come right in. So what is keeping our CIOs and CISOs up at night? At least one of the topics. From a cybersecurity perspective, healthcare industry is suffering. November of last year was not a good month for healthcare. According to Pretness research, there were 58 health data breaches in November alone, the highest number of such events in 2016. So overall, we know that 2016 was not a good year as a whole. And the way they look at these numbers, there's an average of at least one data breach for the health industry taking place every 20 days. Organizations. Let's look at this. 5 challenges facing governance, risk, and compliance. What are these challenges? Of course, you have your organizational challenges. You have complex business processes related to complex IT systems. You have psychological, which most decision makers look at regulations as extra constraint. Financial, there's a cost to compliance. Technical, I mentioned that earlier, I mentioned it now. Adopt a technical framework that can handle your continuously changing regulations. And political, I mentioned earlier the Trump administration and what changes are coming to the pike. But there's always old regs going, but I guarantee you there'll be new ones added. All right, so where does this take us? Let's look at the data. I would like to take a step back and discuss the fact that it's all about the data. If we do not have something important or critical or something that we deem should be protected, why have controls in the first place? You look at this, and then you have regulations brewing. Breaches are hitting every organization globally. Security threats are on the rise. What is going on there? Someone is trying to tackle, get access to data they're not supposed to or authorized to. Combine all your personal data, your financial data, your credit card data, health data, intellectual property, online data, you name it. Lump it all into one bucket and call it protected data. I've had a lot of conversations with different organizations, and they say we're only concerned about PHI, PII, credit card data. No, there's all types of data at most all organizations. Lump it into one bucket and make sure your goal is to protect it all. We implement controls, we enforce policies, and we go through audits to simply prove one thing, that we have controls in place to protect what's important. And this is the concept I'd like to bring forward as far as what I mean by talking about protected data. You ask yourself, do you have control over all the access that you consider trusted to your production environment? Do you have true governance of that trusted access? I'd like to bring this slide up in a way where in our normal day-to-day life, as I mentioned earlier, we are faced with protecting what's important. In a normal day, I have users coming in, end users coming in to access information as part of their job. I have system administrators coming in to maintain my environment. I have my third-party vendors that are coming in, cost-effective way to continue maintaining and help me with other environments. And of course, you have your automated processes that keep your environment up and running. And if you look at this type of access, this is the method and the approach has been taken for years. Now, add to this norm, we have threats to worry about. So you have credentials being broken, exploits we need to face, back doors to cover, treason, insider threat, stolen credentials, and the story goes on. So how can we truly manage access? I highly encourage the fact that two objectives within your organization. One, we must govern all normal or trusted access continuously to allow us the ability to focus on the threats and minimize those threats and risk to our environment. So if there's a gap within your normal access you need to tackle, I'm not sure how you can break your resource and your focus up and look at the threats. So I talk about the gap. This gap that I look at is, you can word it as a control gap, an access gap, a process gap, an IT gap. But at some point, there is a trusted access issue. And I want to just have you think trusted access coming into your protected data. So what am I really talking about? What is this gap that I need to shed some light on? SSH and the technology was invented by Tati Alonen. He's the founder of our company, SSH Communication Security. In the mid-90s it came about. Okay. And it's being used across all production environments. SSH runs on everything that you see on this slide. Mac, Linux, Unix, you name it. Network routers, configuration management tools like Puppet, and so on. And last year, with the announcement of Azure, it's going to run, and is already running, on Windows. So SSH keys are used everywhere. Now, in simple terms, what am I saying about SSH keys? The definition, in my opinion, the way I like to simply say it, it's a key pair that gives you a private key, like a key to your house, granting you access to your house by using that key to get in the door. Same token, that private key, in our example, you'd use to get into a workstation, a server, network device, or whatever. That is being used across all production environments in an elevated fashion. So that type of access is privileged by nature. So if you look at the definition of identity and access management, it's a security discipline that enables the right individuals to access the right resources at the right times for the right reason. I love to put this definition up. I don't like the fact that there are 4 words that are right in one sentence. How many of these rights do we have today remains to be answered by all of us. But if you look at this formula I put up, you have your SSH keys. They are a critical component of your access, along with your credentials, along with all the access you have to your production environment. I have been through audits of all flavors for many years. I joined SSH Communication Security 2 years ago. I'm one of the guilty parties that I've only focused on the 2 items on the right, the credentials, the access, and other type of access. I have not considered SSH keys simply because it was part of the plumbing. It was going under the radar. It comes bundled. And I always thought somebody in IT was taking care of that. So what does SSH have to do with access? Let's find out. Let me give you a little bit more background to give you a better understanding of this. What does the information have to do for the enterprise? And I'm repeating this slide just in case some of you did not see it. A large bank that we assessed, and we looked at their 10,000 Unix hosts. And this is some of the numbers that we saw in terms of SSH keys and the access they grant. They had 1.5 million application keys granting access. They had 70,000 database administrator keys granting access. The same for system administrator keys granting access. 7,000 monitoring keys granting access. These are various automated processes that are running and keeping the environment up and running and availability where it needs to be. Up to 1 billion authentications per year granting access. And out of those, 30 million authentications for the most active key granting access. I mean, I have done this for many years. I've been through many audits in all flavors. None of the data that I had to go through audit and provide samples and audit documentation for came even close to this type of numbers. And the one thing I'd like to highlight is majority of the access is obsolete. I love to bring up this diagram. This is a scary maze. Out of that, a subset of that environment that I just talked about, We wanted to do a topography and show the different connections coming to that production environment. So that light green color in the middle there is production. And all these showing different connections coming into production from various sources. And you can see some of these are coming from miscellaneous, unknowns, development, other production environments, QA, and so on. Even management had access. So if you look at this and say, wait a minute, if I'm truly trying to depict segregation of duties environment, if you show this to a PCI auditor, QSA, ISA, I think we all would be in trouble. I'd like to also highlight, for that example I used, there was about 10% of those connections coming in root level from unknown sources. So not only I have an encrypted session coming in, but it's coming in at a root level, so God on all Unix systems, and I don't know where it's coming from. To me, that is a privileged access nightmare for all organizations. So this picture, I love to show this picture simply because it talks about circumventing the process, okay? We have controls that are in place for excellent reasons. As professionals in our varying industries, we adhere to policies and procedures because it's the right thing to do, and there's a good reason behind it. Compliance paves the way to positive outcomes in terms of security, audit, and much more. But when you look at the normal day, we are faced with deadlines, and we need to get the job done before we leave for the day. SSH is a perfect example. When it's not properly managed, it's a perfect example of how we can circumvent the process. So in many organizations, and I sat in on one conversation with auditors for a major bank, they went through privileged access thorough testing. And through that process, they sat with development, sat with everybody, and they said, you guys have 5 stars for a privileged access process. You have good control. Until one of the developers said, well, you know, I can bypass all that by leveraging my SSH keys. And that was enough to get everything back on the table. So you can see there's a potential of bypassing the process, maliciously or not, by leveraging SSH keys if it's not properly managed. Another favorite picture of mine that always shows that focus, unfortunately, is not always on compliance. The reason I bring this slide up is a good segue into, all right, well, I'm talking about compliance, and I'm talking about SSH keys and the management of that. And NIST, all familiar with NIST, I hope, National Institute for Standards and Technology. They released in the fall of 2015 the NIST IR 7966, and it is addressing in a very excellent way the security of interactive and automated access management using secure shell. I took the liberty of taking a NIST document and put it in a simple white paper that I would be more than happy to share with any of you if you're interested. But what does the NIST IR 7966 talk about? It talks about the security of automated access management using secure shell, released in the fall of 2015. It is a guidance for U.S. government agencies, but private sector, be ready. We all know something starts in the government, somewhere ends up on the private sector. It identifies vulnerabilities that most often exposed to and should be evaluated. And it highlights the hidden risks with poorly managed SSH identities. And it provides, that's what I like about NIST, they give you best practices. They don't just tell you, give you background on what the problem is and the things you're facing. They give you ways that you can go back and fix things, which is excellent. And it maps to industry best practice controls. Just to highlight some of the stuff they talk about, which is worthwhile, they see the vulnerabilities in SSH keys and the management of that. They're vulnerable by the way SSH is being implemented in your environment. If it comes by default and as part of the plumbing is being deployed, is not following any governance or monitoring processes, then yes, your implementation would be vulnerable. Improperly configured access control. As with any access control, if it's not properly configured, you can use it in other ways than intended. Same thing with SSH keys. Stolen, leaked, and unterminated SSH user keys. The bank I referred to earlier, the example, they had keys that were over 10 years old and still active in production. The vulnerabilities would be opening the back doors, unintended usage of user keys. I mean, the keys are out there, administrators are doing the work, they leverage the keys to do more work and may cause open doors unintentionally. And then, of course, lack of knowledge and human errors are a major contributor for the vulnerabilities with SSH keys vulnerabilities. So what are the risks? For those of you who have been involved in many of these audit activities and having to do with the user IDs and hire and transfer and terminate employees and so on, and rotate user IDs and the like and transfer people in and out, the risks are identical. So you look at employees who transferred out or left an organization, the lack of segregation of duties, and that diagram I put out there earlier is a perfect example of a not segregated environment. Leftover unneeded keys. So this is a elevated type of access left over for use. Of course, one big risk is when auditors start adding this stuff to their checklist and they're going to find it, it's going to mean that there are exceptions and findings on your audit report. Human errors and lack of visibility of trust relationships. And I will refer back to that diagram, that spider web. You're not knowing where all the connections are coming from, and not knowing if they're trusted, and not knowing the source, and they're coming in encrypted, is a huge risk. In my opinion, it's a huge nightmare. All right, now that I presented you with a little bit of background, reminded you of the lovely breaches we've had, so now what? What's your takeaway? Best practice. I'm a firm believer in applying best practices that are suitable for the environment you're in, that are flexible to support the deployment of your technology, no matter where your production environment is, and that are flexible enough to accommodate changing regulations. Best practice is key. If you put your hat on as an SSH keys administrator, the remediation process and ongoing governance goes as follows. As you assess the state of your SSH keys, the same way you would do with the access for your employees. The different employees you hire, transfer, and term, and you give them domain or local access. The same way you evaluate that access. The same thing you would need to assess as your SSH keys as your first step. Then discovery is big. You need to identify where these items are, who's using them, where are they used, are they in compliance? And it's, of course, not enough to identify or discover. You need to monitor, because things are continuously changing, as we all know, and ongoing monitoring is an excellent way to ensure governance over that trusted access. Remediate. Once auditors, of course, find out about it, they will push that through, but as a norm for your governance processes, whatever you find that needs to be fixed, take care of it, remediate it, close it. Take care of things before auditors point them out. And of course, govern. Every financial institution I talk to, they have a solid, well-governed process for provisioning access. But I am yet to see any of those encompassing SSH keys. So if we want to put this in simple terms, in terms of implementation takeaways, we must have policies and procedures. I mean, everybody will drive 55 miles an hour on the highway because there's a sign that says speed limit is 55. Without that in place, you can question how fast people will go. Same thing in the work environment. You need to control by policies and procedures how to deploy, how to manage, how to implement, how to configure, and how to allow access to your SSH keys, your elevated access. You need to secure your implementations, as you would secure your firewalls or your perimeter defenses and so forth. The same thing has to happen with this critical elevated access called SSH keys. Control the identities and authorized keys. Not everyone can generate keys to jump from one server to the next. One example that I'd like to bring up is I did not mention the Sony breach. The Sony breach that happened was basically state-sponsored, compromised the credentials of one network administrator or system administrator, and by leveraging those credentials, they were able to go to the first server, and without proper controls to the keys, they were able to generate keys from one server to the next, and they literally took over the entire Sony production environment. Continuous monitoring and audit process. This cannot be a one-time thing. It has to be continuous. And you need to find out where those keys are, and you need to fix what's broken. Now, when you think about that, you think about these numbers, they are huge. They were in the billions in the transactions and the millions in the keys granting access. So what do we do at this point? I encourage you to automate it. This is not something I've witnessed some organizations to try to do it manually. You would throw people 6 to 9 individuals full-time on a yearly basis to just keep up with this process I just walked you through. Automation is key, and I highly recommend that you bring in an expert that knows what SSH keys are about. Of course, SSH communication security is one of them, but any vendor you end up going with, I highly encourage you to automate it and make it part of your processes, your provision processes. And doesn't stop there. Educate, educate, educate. I've had conversations with C-level all the way to the network administrators. They need to know about this. They need to know the risk it brings to the table and the potential impact of a breach leveraging your key infrastructure. So final thought, leave you with that formula that I brought up. As you go back to your organizations, please, and feel free to email me anytime after that. I would love to have that conversation. So look at your credentials, look at your access, and have the conversation. But please do ask if they're considering your SSH keys in your environment. If not, I highly recommend that you start looking at it immediately. With that said, and before we go into Q&A, I would like to again apologize for the technical difficulty with my phone. I think it might keep things a little bit exciting. Where did the presenter go? But thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening. And now we're into Q&A.
Thank you so much, Fuad, for the presentation and handling the technical difficulty with grace. You picked up, I did get some questions, obviously, from folks about what happened to the speaker. We liked him so much. Where did he go? Joke, joke, Fuad. But no, they were wondering what happened. So you picked up right where we had left off, so that's great. We do have a couple questions that came through, so we will take just a few minutes for those that might have to run to another meeting. We'll get through these quickly. Fuad, you'd mentioned a number of different, it says here, you'd mentioned a number of regulations throughout the presentation, but which one most applies to the SSH access gap?
Excellent question. They all do. If you are facing a regulation or you are working with a framework or you're trying to comply with any of those, and if they have any requirements or specifications or standards having to do with access, SSH keys is a huge part of that. So the answer is all of them.
Okay, thank you. And something that you and I hear quite a bit, and it's par for the course, but it's a great question. You know, it says here, if this is such a critical access point, how can it be ignored? Or why has it been ignored for so long, it says?
Well, I mentioned earlier SSH keys became part of the bundle since the 90s. And of course, with OpenSSH, it propagated to all flavors, operating system, network components, and the like. This is part of the bundle. It comes with every operating system and network components. It does not require purchasing decision, which is typically a key control to know what's coming in and out of your production environment. And lastly, from my own experience, I have not seen any audit checklist that says, go look at your SSH keys within your environment, except one mention, which is requirement 4.1 in PCI DSS. So any way you look at it, it's been slipping through the cracks for years.
Okay, and just one final question related to some of the breaches you'd mentioned. Are any of them related to an SSH keys compromise, which you might have alluded to there at the end, but I wanted to at least ask the question since it was brought to the table.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, the first one, as I mentioned earlier, is a Sony breach. Definitely a compromise of a administrator's credentials, and they leverage that to generate keys from one server to the next by taking total control of Sony production environment. Rumor has it that there also is a scenario that has to deal with a certain trader who may have leveraged SSH keys access, poorly configured SSH key access, to go through NSA servers. So yes, there are a few, and these are two big ones that just come to mind.
Well, okay, thank you so much, Fuad, again, for your time today, and everyone on the line, thank you as well. That is the end of this webinar. We will be doing a recording, and that will be provided to you via an email with a link, so you can then listen to it at a later time if you like. If you do have any questions around SSH communication security or the products that we offer and how we can help you govern trusted access, please do not hesitate to check out ssh.com. Once again, thank you, and this will conclude this webinar.